So hello everyone and welcome to the panel entitled COVID-19 in Visual Pop Culture from our Popularizing STEM conference. So our first speaker is Mikhail Fox. He's a postdoc researcher in the project Fiction Meets Science at the University of Oldenburg. He has co-edited 7 essay collections and published more than 60 journal articles and book chapters on horror, the American Gothic, science fiction, video games, American sports, and contemporary North American literature. So I leave you with them.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for the relatively brief introduction. So which is the right screen now? This is always the question. I think this one is the right one. Okay, I think you should be seeing the presentation. As Laura was saying, I'm working on a project at the University of Oldenburg and the University. It is actually a project that runs at the University of Oldenburg and the University of Bremen called Fiction Meets Science. You can see the logo down there below the Spiky Fuzzball that I'm going to talk about. More specifically, this project, this presentation is part of a sub-project that's been running since last April, which appropriately enough is titled Pandemic Meets Fiction, and which explores cultural engagements both with the COVID-19 pandemic and pandemics on a larger scale, sort of to add a little bit of a historical dimension to that. Unfortunately, that project will only run for a year, so it's about to be over. And as you can see here on the title slide, my talk is titled Spiky Fuzzball Goes Viral, or as some others have called it, a spiky blob. Okay, and of course, this doesn't work now. Okay, in an essay on how popular visual culture has engaged with the COVID-19 pandemic, Julia Sonnevent identifies 3 main types of visual cultural artifacts that emerged from the pandemic, and one particular iconic image, or even a particularly iconic image. Now, the first type that Sonnevent highlights are abstract representations of the pandemic, various types of charts showcasing the number of infections, interactive maps demonstrating the spread of the virus around the world, illustrations trying to convince viewers that flattening the curve is the only way to contain the viral spread, and so on. Type number 2 are representations of heroes and villains of the pandemic. In the US context, there is the sheer omnipresence of Anthony Fauci. On this particular slide here, 4 illustrations that portray him in a more positive way. But as you will note there, the conservatives frequently figured him as a kind of devil in disguise as well. There are photos and other types of representations of the frontline heroes of the pandemic, doctors, nurses, and other types of health workers and medical staff. And as I mentioned, and as was already indicated in a previous panel, in a certain way, there's also the kind of villains of the pandemic here, a neat satire that combines the heroic self-image of Trump with the reality of failing to react properly to the challenges of the pandemic. But as we also heard in the previous panel, he was definitely not the only leader who pretty much failed in that respect to cope with that new situation. And finally, the third major genre, according to Sonnevent, is what she calls the stage of the crisis. That's the spaces and places that are typically associated with COVID-19. That's practically empty streets, for example, here in the middle of New York City, tents set up to deal with the high number of infected people, the images of COVID mass graves in New York City that went around the globe, and so on. But there is one particular viral image tied to the COVID-19 pandemic, an icon of the pandemic, if you will, and namely the 3D rendering. We also saw that before in the previous panel already, of the novel coronavirus that was created by 2 medical illustrators who were working for the CDC, Alyssa Eckert and Dan Higgins. As Eckert explained in an interview with Elemental, quoting now here, you can see the quote on the slide anyways, the image was originally designed with the public in mind. However, it also serves to help researchers differentiate and visualize their information. Creating visual representations of diseases provides a way to take something complex and abstract and make it tangible through visualization. The Elemental article that featured that illustration in the interview also included an explanation of the 3D rendering. And I'll just go through that very quickly. Some of you might have seen that before in one way or another, but it basically explains here that the gray surface is a spherical envelope that surrounds the nucleus of the virus containing genetic material. The orange bits are the so-called membrane proteins or M proteins, the most abundant structural protein in the virus and one that gives it form. These and other proteins vary from one type to virus of another and can be used to help understand or identify one virus from another. The yellow bits are the so-called envelope proteins or E proteins, the smallest of the structural proteins. They, according to some other research, quoting, play an important role either in regulating virus replication, such as virus entry, assembly, and release. And finally, the red spikes are the so-called S proteins or clumps of proteins that are what Eckert describes as what the virus is used to gain entry into and attach to the cell. They also create the effect of a halo or corona around the virus. In other words, by giving the virus a visual form, by kind of, as a New York Times article put it, bringing the unseeable into view, the illustration seeks to kind of explain the virus, tries to make it the terrifying world that is associated with the virus around us feel more comprehensible in a certain way. And as we all know, the 3D rendering indeed quickly became an icon of the pandemic, accompanying practically every release by the CDC, and it also quickly became part of popular visual discourse and the grammar of popular visual discourse, being adapted and appropriated in various ways and contexts. And again, we saw a number of examples before, but just to bring up, I think I have 4 again here. Representing the struggle between science and skepticism towards science, symbolizing the kind of seemingly never-ending struggle of healthcare workers, as an icon kind of satirically calling upon people to ignore the suggestions by the CDC and similar organizations, as an emblem of distance learning around the globe. And of course, there's tons more of examples like these. Many, if not all of these representations, of course, are open to a number of different readings. And as Marina pointed out in the previous panel, the virus tends to be either anthropomorphized in these representations, or at the very least, there are certain human reference points in these illustrations, which is key to a point that I'll kind of make later. Now, of course, as an icon, there have been challengers to the 3D rendering created by Eckert and Higgins and its rank of icon of the COVID era. And again, a couple of these images were shown in the previous panel, primarily by Marina. The CDC released electron microscope images a few weeks after the 3D illustration was published, as did the German Robert Koch Institute. These images, this is again from the German Robert Koch Institute, purport to be kind of more authentic, for the lack of a better word, than the 3D rendering, because they are kind of photographs. They, so to say, they depict the real thing, unlike the illustration, which is of course human-made. But the 3D rendering and various variations thereof have perceived weird, and one might wonder why. Now, as you can imagine, quite a few scholars have already written about the aesthetics of the 3D rendering, both in online outfits such as blogs and in a handful of journal articles as well. Now, I too mentioned earlier already that the illustration in certain ways seeks to at the very least create the illusion of understanding the virus, to in a way control the virus, but of course there's more to that. In a contribution to the Medical Humanities blog, Christine Marie Bivens and Marie Möller complained that the, quote, scientifically oriented representation misses the opportunity to humanize and contextualize the novel coronavirus. They go on to appreciate the illustration's visually pleasing form, but critique that it, quoting again, avoids conveying the exigency of the current pandemic, the urgency of enacting certain behaviors during this global health crisis, and the human toll it is exacting across the globe. Bivens and Möller suggest that COVID-19 images should be gross, they should be graphic, and they should be grotesque. This conclusion is pretty much, interestingly enough, very much in opposition to a 2-part post on the blog Inhabiting the Anthropocene, which is run by scholars at the University of Oklahoma. And on that blog, art historian Robert Bailey expresses a rather different opinion. As for him, the image of the COVID-19 virus, of the coronavirus, is actually too horrific. To use the title of the post, Bailey argues that the coronavirus looks like neoliberalism, since the kind of visualization attacks individuals rather than governments or other collective entities. Quoting here again, the spiky blob tells us to be afraid for our lives and to act accordingly. But afraid of what? Not of God, but of everything. A part of us deep within automatically registers and accepts its prompt in the name of basic survival instinct. Since the red spikes on the front are in focus and the others become increasingly blurry, argues Bailey, the 3D rendering creates the impression that the virus is directed toward the viewer, are ready kind of to pounce on them. And even though Bivens and Miller on the one hand and Bailey on the other approach the viral image from very different points of view and draw very different conclusions, both pieces in a certain way express that they miss a kind of human component. In Bailey's reading of the image, the human may be implied as sort of a potential target, and of course as the creator of the image, but the image kind of lacks a human reference point. Indeed, when looking at the full CDC image, which presents the virus against a dark background with orange dots that possibly hint at more viruses lurking in the darkness, the cosmic dimension evoked by the virus becomes apparent. The virus is kind of hovering in dark space. There is a science fictional quality to the image that different appropriations of the image might, as a matter of fact, bring to the fore even more than the original image. However, already the original illustrations offers this cosmic dimension. The illustration might try to contain, make knowable and understandable a virus, but the question is whether we can truly comprehend the virus in the first place. From that perspective, and I'm sorry that I'm only kind of opening a can of worms in a certain way here, the virus is intricately tied to the Anthropocene, which is on one level arguably characterized by the growing awareness that the more we believe to know about the world, the less we in fact do know about the world. The more we believe to control the world, the less in fact we do control the world. As I was looking for coronavirus illustrations while preparing for this talk, I actually chanced upon this image here. This was part of an exhibition in the Dutch city of Eindhoven that took place last summer and early fall and was titled Bestiary of the Anthropocene, Hybrid Plants, Animals, Fungi, and Other Specimens. In the book that goes along with the exhibition, you can find the coronavirus in a section titled Kingdom of Miscellaneous. Alongside entries such as radioactive mushrooms, artificial snow, and cloud seeding, you know, the practice to sow clouds in order to increase precipitation in soft drought-prone regions. As the description of the coronavirus explains, quoting here from the bottom paragraph, the COVID-19 pandemic is a disaster that has human origins, a product of the Anthropocene, due to our actions that contribute to weakening natural ecosystems, thus promoting the spread of pathogens. Now, this weakening of ecosystems also involves the eradication of certain microorganisms, that is, viruses and bacteria, as, for example, Martin Blazer details in his book, Missing Microbes. To be sure, seeing these links between the ongoing pandemic and the Anthropocene might feel somewhat uncanny, considering that in his iconic piece on the geology of mankind that was published in a 2002 issue of Nature, Paul Crutzen stressed that, quoting, unless there is a global catastrophe, a meteorite impact, a world war, or a pandemic, mankind will remain a major environmental force for millennia. As most of you will probably know, despite the media focus on the positive environmental effects of the lockdown, in particular in spring 2020, these positive effects were not only short-term, but in fact also entailed negative effects. Consciously or not, the CDC rendering is embedded in these discourses. By evoking a cosmic perspective and focusing on a life form that embodies the entangled nature of life, it reveals that, to draw on the title of a book by Ed Young, which of course in itself then echoes an iconic line in a Walt Whitman poem, "We contain multitudes." Accordingly, we, with all the baggage that this seemingly inclusive and universal term that erases all sorts of differences and historical circumstances, kind of might start thinking about other, dare I say, proper ways of, as the Bible puts it, serving the garden in which we have been placed. In theory, we could sit around, read books, never be subjected to clock time as institutionalized by capitalism, and just let the world feed us and us feed the world. A utopian image that at least implicitly implies the radical reduction of the number of human beings on the planet. Clearly, we, again, problematic term, decided to pursue a different path. In view of the results of the recent climate meeting in Glasgow, it seems that our leaders are unwilling to steer the ship of humankind into a different direction. Thus, the COVID image, the coronavirus image, might indicate that it might be time that we started blowing up pipelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail, for such an interesting analysis of the COVID image. We are gonna move on with Marta Marini. She is a PhD fellow at the Universidad Alcalá, Institute of Franklin for American Studies, and her main research interests are connected to the representation of the US-Mexico borderlands and Mexican-American heritage in popular culture, focusing in particular on horror, noir, and weird Western narratives. And she is going to present Visualizing the Unseeable, the COVID-19 virus in US ethnic political cartoons.
Thank you, Laura. So, as the presenters before me highlighted, I think very well, translating specialized information into something that the broader non-specialized public can understand is key to help people instantly visualizing science and scientific findings besides abstract data. The visible and material consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic can be documented, of course, and we've seen pictures of ill and dead people, as well as images of the economic consequences and images conveying the post-apocalyptic vibe that especially the first lockdown brought to us. However, the unseeable quality of the viral spread itself has made it difficult to communicate and represent the crisis for the public. The rendering created by medical illustrators that Mikhail talked about was quickly adopted by media and became a familiar visual sign for people all over the world, generated as close-up reproduction, sort of the ultrastructural morphology of coronaviruses. The image is now iconic and has come to embody the pandemic, its scope, and the fears that it has instilled in the public. And now my slides don't work. Okay. The use of the virus image in popular culture and discourse can be traced in the depictions of the pandemic that have marked US political cartoons since the start of the spread by both right and left leaning cartoonists. And political cartoons are, as I was saying before, I think a very interesting type of text as they play on cognitive associations peculiar to a national culture, touching upon shared fear. And in a case like this, confronting a topic that is global through its local facets. As Mitchell Moore has stressed, political cartoons are a graphic version of an editorial, since they analyze and interpret a situation, influencing and orienting the readers toward a stance on the issue represented. And they embody a kind of news discourse that's opinion news that enables the public to judge what is happening on the basis of the cartoonist rendition of it, and thus organize and interpret what they see, giving meaning to it within their own set of values and beliefs. And of course, on the cartoonist part, there is an assumed shared political and cultural knowledge that allows the readers to catch and interpret the visual and verbal references, as well as an assumed up-to-date knowledge, since quite often cartoons are based on immediacy and the timely depiction of the most recent turn of events. Medhurst and D'Souza traced a few fundamental parameters to analyze political cartoons, and they defined one as the political commonplace. something that the readers are assumed to be familiar with and that they can identify as a cue that the topic described is related to politics. And I would say that in the case of COVID-related cartoons, the virus image definitely embodies this kind of element. As during the pandemic, most information, communication, and news about it have been inherently political. I will go through a few specific themes and metaphors that have been used in US political cartoons and show how Latinx and Native cartoonists have relied on specific perspectives and topics specific to their communities to build their political satire. As the pandemic hit during the already controversial Trump administration, the crisis was also instrumental to the caricatural representation of the ex-president himself, his actuation, and his supporter stance. Out of these, I like, in particular, Ken Catalina's Into the Sunset, as it plays not just with the situational component, which is the element that you understand if you're up to date with the news. And in this case, is the connection between Trump and the virus and how bad it was going. But it also draws on and plays with the myth of the West that is fundamental for American nationalism and the dominant culture tropes that Trump did embody and took to an extreme during his administration. Here you can see 3 cartoons by Tom Stiglich, right-leaning artist who has not really ever criticized Trump's handling of the pandemic. And this is just for a taste of it, as many other conservative cartoonists have criticized the ex-president despite their political stance. And Stiglich's are particularly racist and stereotyping, but I think it's interesting what we were commenting on before about the shifting the blame for the pandemic. The one on the right I find interesting as it is a relatively recurrent theme. The virus as a meteorite and in general space-themed cartoons that appeal to a variety of fears and imaginaries. You know, it's the danger that comes from space and we're not really able to oppose. It's beyond our control and it's going to exterminate us all. And it appears actually, I have to say, in particular in conservative and moderate cartoons. Here you can see more of it. Steve Breen on the left is published by center-left media. David Horsey on the right as well. This is moderate Phil Hands on the left, while liberal Steve Benson on the right takes the space theme to a different direction, playing with the solar eclipses that occurred during Trump's administration as well. The virus has been used to represent the embodiment of Trump supporters as well. And this is Phil Hands again on the left. While on the right, we have Lalo Alcalá, the first Latinx cartoonist I'm going to show in this presentation. Alcalá leans left and is very vocal about issues related to the Latinx communities, and he's as well the most known Chicanx cartoonist, as is syndicated. And he's been involved in various mainstream events and projects, more or less controversially, if you ask me. Notably the Disney's Coco animated film. Here you can see that he's been using the virus image in many different ways. He often represents Trump's face with a shape that evokes a scrotum. But in this case, he's making Trump the virus. I would say that the structure of his cartoons is usually quite simple. Often the metaphor, as you can see, is immediate and quite all-encompassing, understandable by the American public very broadly. However, he does disseminate Chicanx references here and there, and whenever it is relevant, he tackles topics that are not as broadly shared in a way. So the immigrant population of agricultural laborers, who are mostly of Mexican origin and in most recent years, Central Americans as well, has been hit by the pandemic very hard. not only the undocumented ones. In general, this is a sector that has never stopped working, even in the worst moments of the pandemic. And it is clearly a type of employment that does not provide healthcare and insurance. It's pretty close to indentured labor. And of course, this raises the topic of the limited access to vaccines for these laborers and treatment, who keep on working, they get sick, they spread more, they die, and they simply get replaced. In this case, the cultural reference is overt. This is one of the best known engravings by José Guadalupe Posada. His calaveras were a satirical political commentary on Mexican society in the Porfiriato era. Here, Alvarez is exposing his own people in a way that they surely understand and interpret in the correct, meaningful way. He's criticizing Latinx citizens for organizing parties and backyard barbecues during the pandemic. And everybody did, but he is targeting correctly the Latinx communities to send a message to them that they can recognize. Here we have Michael Ramirez. He's a conservative Latinx artist. He tackles a topic that connected for a while, undocumented immigrants and COVID. He's usually critical of undocumented immigration, but he's equally critical of how the Trump administration handled the border. And in general, he seems to understand that immigration is not an easy choice as conservative media tend to depict it. In this case, even if he seems to abide by the idea that immigrants, to an extent, bring COVID to the States, his depiction is quite accurate and it doesn't fall into crass stereotypes. Latinx cartoonists draw on depictions of death that are remindful of Latinx heritage and the Santa Muerte cults, indeed. And in general, death as a character is much more recurrent in their cartoons. Ramirez has many. I find the one on the left particularly interesting as it couples death and the virus icon in a rather poetic, pretty gloomy way. And it's absolutely effective, I think, without any verbal element at all. On to Eric Garcia. He's a Chicanx artist and activist, strongly left-leaning, who embodied the virus with his death character. His cartoons are often very layered in meaning and figure of speech. So without dedicating too much time to this, on the left, he also is touching upon agricultural laborers as being offered to the capitalist strata of society by the government itself, represented as Uncle Sam. On the right, he exposes how deportation has been carried out during the pandemic, at times even in greater volumes, and COVID is distilled as a poisonous weapon indirectly. Here on the left, we see how he has been represented the virus most often as a sort of toxic cloud disseminating a tiny viruses. And again, this refers to some news about the imposed non-consensual sterilization and surgeries performed on migrant women in ICE detention centers. On the right, Garcia is always quite attentive to communities outside the Latinx ones. And in this case, the virus becomes a monster among things, threatening and oppressing the Black community. In this case, he's denouncing the fact that the Trump administration revoked reservation status to the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in Massachusetts amid the coronavirus crisis in April 2020, instead of supporting Native communities, which have struggled particularly. For various reasons, they did so, mostly structural violence, that is, for example, limited access to healthcare, in-person labor, genetic predisposition to specific diseases such as diabetes. Official data on this also was overlooked and modeled quite often. And Garcia reprises here a historical topic connecting it to the pandemic, as the government was providing half-assed support to Native American communities, he equates such a stance with the North American colonist biological warfare practice to give blankets to native tribes that were contaminated with smallpox. Marty Tubos is a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe. His cartoons are quite articulated and layered as well. As you can see here, Death as a character appears relatively often in his COVID-related cartoons. And he has also often used the virus as the virus icon as a graphic element, framing the cartoon, as you can see on the right, as a sort of wallpaper in both the Republican and Democratic colors. Here you can see his take on the nonsense Sturgis motorcycle rally, South Dakota, that caused a relevant increase in cases in the region, hitting Native American communities as well. The Great Sioux Nation groups tried to prevent the participants' access across tribal lands against federal and state authorities, which claimed that their checkpoints were illegal, so that people that were participating in the rally could go across anyway. On the right, you can see how we represented the cultural and socioeconomical character of the spread in Native communities, as many households are intergenerational, and thus younger family members would bring COVID home from work to their grandparents. And the one in the center exposing tourists, they just love that virus monster so much for some reason. Getting to a close, Ricardo Cate is of Kiowa Pueblo heritage, and he has published the daily cartoons without reservation since 2006 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. His cartoons are political satire in most cases, but it does not depict current news. Usually, it's more of a commentary on life in a Native community, also poking fun at his own people. But I'd say that since the Trump administration and the pandemic, he has addressed timely topics a lot more. And he's been drawing some cartoons for Twitter specifically. And as you can see, the virus image again is a leitmotif. On the left, his coloring book. It was released during the pandemic to raise awareness of COVID-19 dangers for children. And inside, it has some explanation on COVID measures and so on. So I would say that even though the fundamental elements of the representation of COVID news and fears are shared throughout political cartoon production during the pandemic, and they do appeal to a broad public in general, cartoonists who belong to specific ethnic communities and identify with a non-dominant cultural heritage, I think do show specific ways to tackle pandemic issues, and whether in the choice of topic, for example, the immigrant laborers issues, or the political stance, or again, either metaphors, motifs, or issues that are very specific to their own culture and communities. And with this, I am done.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that very interesting analysis of the cartoons. So we are going to move on now to the Q&A session. And I think this might stir up some conversation because it speaks very well with the previous roundtable that we've just had, also on COVID cartoons. But while the public warms up a little bit and maybe comes up with some other questions, I'm gonna start with, so I think something that connects both your presentations mainly is the part of the visual culture, right? How Mikhail was speaking of how this image of the COVID, the drawing of the virus, became a really prevalent image. And as we've seen in the cartoons, we can identify it very easily. It's become a really something that we see every day on the news and different iterations of it. So this is maybe what I want to ask you about, in the sense that, and I was noticing during the pandemic, I was noticing how in the local news they would have this render of the virus and it would be different every day. Like it would have like kind of different spikes and different colors. And in the background of your presentation, Mikhail, so it was orange, and other times in the drawings is green or blue. And so why do you think this is, how do you think these changes work in the visual culture? If there is some tendency that you can identify in the designs, and for more focused on Anna's analysis about maybe the drawing style that changes from one cartoon to the other, and if there's a specific say because of ethnic motives or for political stance motives, if there's more tendency. I thought it was very interesting how certain cartoonists will employ more, will bring more things into the virus, like make it the face of Trump, or have it have a little body, or like include different things in the virus in itself. There was also another one that had people inside of it. So if you could comment a little bit on this idea of the visual culture and the design and these things.
I guess I'll start. I think one important thing that I didn't mention is that the actual color choices for the original 3D rendering, they were kind of at the very least in part defined by a certain branding strategy of the CDC, which is interesting to say the least. It seemed like the artists, based on a couple of interviews that I read, had like 4 or 5 options in terms of the colors that they could use in the illustration, and they ended up with the primarily gray one because they said this is probably how the body of the virus kind of looks. And with the spikes, the idea to have them in red was really to indicate the danger at the end of the day, which I guess also comes across in especially the reading by Robert Bailey, who highlights, that at the end of the day, the spikes coming at you sort of feel like, there's this danger that emanates from the virus. So it's in a certain way really interesting that the actual color choices were made in a certain way by a branding strategy for CDC, because it had to fit into their material that they were trying to send out about the coronavirus in spring 2020. As far as the color changes and so on go, I mean, I think one thing that's pretty common, and that was that was something that you could also see not only in my slide background, but also in many of the images that Anna showed, is this a little bit more playful, if you will, kind of in a certain way also less dangerous, because the spikes are kind of rounded off and stuff like that. So I think it sort of, I don't know, it's hard to say, but I guess in a certain way it becomes less dangerous. It's kind of oversimplifying matters probably. Another thing that I noticed is that on the one hand, as I was saying, the original image is already science fictional. So what you actually see in many of the primarily, again, 3D renderings of the image that sort of draw on the original illustration is that they use combinations of usually darker colors and black and blue, the typical images that we have associated with on the one hand, outer space, but also the deep sea in a certain way. So you play with these two kind of image clusters, that you have in popular culture, and that really also play into the way in which the virus is then kind of set in motion. It seems like it's flowing through space or flowing through water. In one of the illustrations, it was pretty clear that it's actually blood, and of course the virus is in blood, but there is this sort of science fictional strategy also to the color choices. There's also a couple that use pretty neon type colors, and that goes into the same direction, I would argue. I'll leave the rest to Anna.
Yeah, I think what I found interesting is that quite often the color in cartoons is green. And green, I don't know, green is a bit of often a color of illness, a color of bad feelings, sometimes the bad villain or villainess in cartoons has a green halo and stuff like that. So that is the kind of color that surely feels kind of alien to people, and you know, the ones that in almost the last one, the one that was bringing home the virus to his grandparents, that was really kind of alienish in a way. And I thought that that was interesting, although not surprising in a way. And what you were saying now about the sea, actually, I had another one that I didn't put that was representing it as sea mines, sea bombs. So there was like, we were society, American society was a ship above, and there were these mines that were kind of going with this COVID virus shape. So yeah, I guess that it sort of made it look less threatening in a way, and at the same time, it took ways that are very recognizable and very popular culture. So you get the aliens, you get the monsters. The other one, Garcia put in the monster that looks a bit like the monster from the lagoon or something that was threatening the Black community. So I guess they did play with stuff that people know already. And in another way, as I was saying, I found very interesting the meteorite metaphor, which also I think plays with what we were talking before about shifting the blame. If this is a meteorite that falls on us and we cannot really do anything about it. And I think it was interesting that that kind of image appeared more on conservative cartoons than it did on cartoons that were really criticizing the handling of the pandemic and in general Trump administration, and how the scientific information was conveyed by the administration. So I don't know. I don't know if there's really. I wouldn't say that it's just making it more acceptable or less threatening, but on the other hand, it's really feeding on images, horror in a way, monsters, aliens, and stuff that we can recognize as we should feel threatened by. I guess that was maybe the mechanism, and sort of trying to make you feel threatened in a cartoonish way. I don't know. I mean,
no, I think that's very, very interesting that you both kind of associated the visual culture that this has with our images and associations that we already have for science fiction horror, or like horror science fiction in a sense. And I haven't thought of that, and it's actually very interesting that it connects to what Anna, what you were saying. It kind of prefigures what we see in the image of the virus with kind of an outside threat, like a science fiction, that this idea of the pandemic is of course something that we see as science fiction, like something that we thought wouldn't happen. It's kind of a dystopia that we are living in, right? So this idea that it's a threat either coming from outer space, or like a meteorite, or even something from deep in the sea. Yeah, so these connotations that you bring up, I think they're very interesting in that sense.
Just before you give the hand to Emily, it's also, of course, if you think back, especially the early weeks, when you had, again, the image that I showed, for example, the empty streets in New York City. I mean, even there, reports made it pretty clear. It looks like, zombie towns. So you even had popular discourse sort of making these images explicit, how they're linked to popular culture images that we know before. So yeah.
So yeah, I'm gonna give, we have a question from Emily Cox-Palmer-White in the chat. She asks, can you both comment on plush toy versions of the virus? Who is the audience for this?
Are there? I'm not up to
sure
date.
There are.
To be honest, yeah, I'm not up to date with coronavirus.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen them, but they probably exist. I will think.
Yeah, they surely exist, but with all the kinds
They
of
are there. There's actually like a line of plush toys with cells and different viruses and stuff. This exists.
oh, they look horrible as well. I see them now.
Well,
Okay, thank you. This is very cheesy. I mean,
also there is the fact that what I was saying, because the line that exists, there's like an equally plush toy. So this surely comes from like a trend that pre-existed COVID.
yeah, I guess, and they really look like, you know, isn't there this trend of those plush toys that have an angry face, and then you can change them and make a happy face? Doesn't this look a bit like that? You know, kind of like putting on a happy face on something that shouldn't have it, or I don't know.
Oh, it is actually pretty ugly.
You know, I mean,
I've just seen it.
if you were to take it to the extreme, you could probably say this is a perfect example of Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism. You will make money off anything that relates to any sort of disaster or crisis. But yeah, I really don't know as to target groups.
Kind of
I
like,
think I have actually seen one in the waiting room of my doctor, but that's, you know, yeah, maybe. For the kids to play, I don't know what the actual purpose there is, but yeah.
that is a bit cringy. To make it more friendly for kids or something. Ugh. It shouldn't be friendly, you know.
Yeah, COVID friendly or things that are not friendly for the COVID. We have another question from Martin Butler. Yeah, there you are.
Yeah, thank you too for your presentations. I was away from my keyboard for a couple of minutes, so maybe you've already answered my question. I was interested in whether or not you've also historicized these visualizations of the coronavirus, for instance, with reference to the to illustrations or depictions of HIV or other viruses. And can you relate to this in terms of the significance of visualization when it comes to other viral diseases? So why is it in particular the coronavirus that seems to lend itself for this, you know, broad or wide dissemination through visual depictions? Because if you compare it to other visualizations of viruses, such as the flu or HIV, it's not so different at all.
Yeah, well, you go first.
Okay, I go first. As far as the 3D renderings are concerned, I mean, there's quite a discussion, or rather, let's put it that way, the discussion of the coronavirus in terms of how it's been stylized in kind of, you know, the science communication part is always references the visualizations of HIV, especially in the late 80s and early 90s. Also, primarily kind of trying to make the point that is, again, especially in the 1980s, the visualizations of HIV were kind of more friendly, apparently. I mean, I can't quite, that's at the very least the academic discourse. I'm not quite sure whether I agree with that, to be honest, but again, different contexts and whatnot. But there's generally sort of this assumption that the representations of HIV were kind of also more clearly embedded in sort of social context and scripts and whatnot. They were not, especially again with that particular image by the CDC, that it's not this lonely image of the virus, but rather that the HIV was connected to people. And hence you could also relate to the virus in positive or negative ways, that it more clearly sort of kind of tried to show you how to react to the virus. Yeah, that's at the very least the little bit of context that I can give in these couple of minutes here for the coronavirus 3D image.
I think personally, I've looked at quite some stuff just to compare. cartoons and papers on cartoons that came out for the previous pandemic, the swine flu, so-called swine flu. And I have to say that in that case, since it was named swine flu, and in particular in US political cartoons, since it was said that it came from Mexico, most of the cartoons were about pigs, and even sort of made sort of virusy pigs, you know, either cyclic pigs or swarms of pigs and stuff like that. And of course, Mexicans that are also called pigs quite often. So there was really, I think in that case, there was way too much cultural layering there to actually focus on the virus. And I think that anyway, to an extent, it was not something that hit us globally in the same way, and it didn't hit the United States so much, besides the fact that there was this discourse that Mexicans were bringing the swine flu to the United States. So it was something, it was more of a commentary, of a satire on how them dirty Mexicans were spreading this illness, you know. So there was not, and if I have to think about it, I would say that in Mexico, I don't know, cartoons are not that are not a medium used as much as in American press. And of course, they were on the other hand of the issue. So they were really sort of avoiding representing this. They were really avoiding to give a visual representation of what was going on, really. So I guess that's what I can say, because I was really I was just looking to compare between the coronavirus pandemic and that one that was sort of closer, but it couldn't be compared, really.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who's here, and especially to our two panelists. And we're going to close here because we are getting a little bit over time and we have our keynote shortly. So thank you very much.